Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. Today I will be continuing the discussion that I started a couple of days ago on the Apostle Paul. First, to me, the message of Paul is significant, not only in the context of Christianity, but also in the context of all of the dispensations of God. All of the prophets of God, in a sense, can be used and related to what Paul did. Here's what I mean by that. Paul showed that the gospel could be applied universally. That idea has been accepted not only by Christians, by some Christians, not most. The majority of evangelical Christians have a very different view, which I'll speak about in a bit. But also by atheists. The famous Marxist scholar Slavoj Žižek believes in Pauline Universalism, even though he is an atheist. He refers to himself as a Christian atheist. What he means by that is that he loves Paul, he loves Jesus, he loves the Gospels, and he loves the Bible, but he considers Jesus and Paul and the other figures mentioned in the Bible as ordinary human beings. But still, he believes in Pauline Universalism. Now, Pauline Universalism is opposed by the vast majority of evangelical Christians. And I think that problem began with some of the church fathers who took the gospel of Christ as interpreted by Paul and turned it into a kind of systematic or dogmatic theology. But as I said previously, Paul was not a systematic theologian. He was, in my view, a messenger of God. In Greek, the word was apostolos, which means apostle or messenger. He was not one of the 12 apostles appointed by Jesus Christ, and yet following a vision of Jesus on the Damascus highway, he began referring to himself as an apostle. The majority of Christians, however, evangelical Christians, take the message of Paul, or the epistles of Paul, and they try to combine them all together so that they try to make everything that Paul said applicable to all churches. And in doing that, all of them, to one extent or another, from my own studies, have failed. I had a discussion a few years ago with this person in an auto shop. It was when I was purchasing my new car, and he was not actually the salesperson, but he was a guy I just happened to meet there, and we got into a conversation. Nice guy. And he asked me what I did, and I said I was a sociologist and that I specialized in the sociology of religion. And he asked me exactly what I meant by that. And I said, well, let me give you one example. Many people have turned to the Apostle Paul, and they claim to follow everything that Paul said, but the vast majority of them really do not. For example, when Paul said, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but if they have a question, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the churches." That was specifically a message that Paul was giving to the church at Corinth. Now, most churches don't follow that. Even the most fundamentalist of churches that I have studied don't follow that. When I have asked people about it, they have told me, well, that was meant only for that time. And my response is yes, it was meant for that time. It was also meant for that particular location. It was meant for the Corinthians. It was not meant for the Ephesians. It was not meant for the Galatians. It was not meant for the Romans. It was meant for the Corinthians. That concept of Pauline Universalism, where the epistles of Christ took the gospel and applied them to different cultures, the various cultures that Paul had traveled to, as a follower and promoter of the message of Christ, as a dependent or lesser prophet on the laws and teachings of the gospel, can similarly be applied to other cultures around the world. Here's how I will expand what I said earlier. That same basic idea of universality, or Pauline Universalism in a sense, can be applied, I think, to virtually, perhaps even all, of the revelations of God's major prophets. In other words, all the teachings of the prophets, according to Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, he says, were meant to be universal. The only reason, as he said through his secretary, that they did not become universal was because of the incompetence of their followers, meaning their followers did not spread those teachings universally, but in and of themselves, those messages were fit to become universal. How? By showing people how they could take the teachings of those prophets and apply them to their own culture. So, applying the teachings of Paul does not mean reading what Paul said to the church at Corinth and literally trying to apply them to today, or reading what Paul said to the church at Ephesus, or to the Galatians or the Romans, and trying to apply them today, or to some other culture during the Christian dispensation, but applying the gospel of Christ to various cultures around the world. Similarly, when I travel taught to Central Africa, to what was then Zaire, to what is now the Republic of the Congo, the devotional portion of our 19-day feasts, every 19 days, Baha'is come together and pray, discuss about the community, issues concerning the community, and socialize. The devotional portion of their feasts included a lot of African dancing and singing. Literally, there was a performance during every feast I saw when I was in Zaire. The feasts were entirely different than anything I have seen here in the US, and yet they were certainly in keeping with the spirit of feasts as they were explained by Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith. So in a sense, that principle that was established by Paul, that principle of Pauline Universalism, is being applied even now, whether knowingly or not, by people in the various communities of the world. give you another example. Back in the early 1970s or the mid 1970s, when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Georgia, there were a couple of recent immigrants from Iran who were at the feast. And when I was praying, I believe I had my hands on my lap. After the meeting was over, the Iranian woman politely came up to me and said, "I think we should pray like this." In other words, she had her hands crossed. And I said, "Well, that's an Iranian custom." And she turned to her husband, and her husband nodded yes. After that point, she never crossed her hands again while she was praying. Obviously, she didn't know that. And so I just saw that as an example of how people can learn. In other words, that custom of crossing one's arms while one is praying is done in Iran. But one should not expect it to be done in other places. In a similar way, it is very common in Iran for people to dislike dogs. Dogs are commonly seen, maybe not quite as badly, but almost as badly as Americans would see rats. Very few Iranians have dogs as pets. When Iranians come to this country, they are frequently surprised when they go to Bahá'í meetings and they see that Baha'is have dogs in their home, sometimes running around the area where the Bahá'í meeting is taking place. Again, there is no teaching in the Bahá'í faith against having dogs. That is an Iranian custom. And so the way in which feasts are conducted and other meetings are conducted in Iran or anywhere else in the world should not be expected to be the same, because every culture is unique. And again, I think we can learn that message of universality from the great and beautiful prophethood of the Apostle Paul. That concludes this episode of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. Have a good one.